Some places hold memories so painful you spend a lifetime running from them. For Fern Talcott, that place was the mountain home she fled 35 years ago. Now in her early 60s, she's finally come back with her German shepherd, Boone. The house is falling apart, swallowed by oaks and time. Fern isn't here for nostalgia. She's here to settle something she should have faced long ago. While clearing out the old porch, Boone discovers a hidden cellar door beneath the rotted boards. What they find inside changes everything. It's tied to her brother who vanished without a trace, a night no one ever spoke about, and the secret that drove her away. What really happened the night her brother disappeared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel road had narrowed to little more than 2 ruts through yellowing grass by the time Fern Talcott's truck crested the final ridge. She'd driven these mountains as a girl, but memory had softened the edges of how remote this place truly was. The November sky hung low and grey, promising snow before week's end. In the passenger seat, Boone lifted his head, ears forward, sensing they'd arrived somewhere significant. Fern pulled the truck to a stop where the road ended and sat for a long moment, hand still gripping the wheel. Through the windshield, past the wild tangle of brambles and the skeletal reach of oak branches, she could see it. The house where she'd spent the first 17 years of her life. It looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. The cedar siding had weathered to the color of ash, and the front porch sagged in the middle like a tired spine. The stone chimney still stood, but half the shingles were gone from the roof, leaving dark patches where rain had gotten in. Ivy had claimed the east wall entirely, thick runners disappearing under loose boards and emerging again near the eaves. The 2 front windows stared back at her like empty eye sockets. "Well," Fern said quietly, more to herself than to the dog. "Here we are." Boone whined softly, a question in the sound. She'd adopted him 3 years ago, not long after her husband Paul passed. The shelter had warned her he was a handful, high energy, needed space, probably wouldn't do well in her small house in town. But when she'd looked into those intelligent brown eyes, she'd seen something she recognized. A creature who'd lost something and was still figuring out how to live with the absence. They'd suited each other just fine. Fern opened the truck door and stepped out onto ground she hadn't touched in 35 years. The air smelled different up here. Pine and damp earth and something wilder underneath. Boone leaped down beside her and immediately began investigating, nose to the ground, tail working slowly back and forth. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like rushing water. Fern pulled her canvas jacket tighter and started toward the house, boots crunching through fallen leaves. Each step felt heavier than the last. She'd been 62 years old for 3 weeks now, retired from teaching for 2 years, widowed for 3. Her life in the valley town of Millerton had become a series of comfortable routines. Morning coffee on the back step, afternoon walks with Boone, evenings spent reading or working through the crossword puzzle. She had friends from the school where she'd taught English for 30 years. She had her small house with its tidy garden. She had enough, but she didn't have peace. The lawyer's letter had arrived 6 months ago, formal and impersonal, informing her that the property taxes on this mountain parcel were 3 years delinquent. As the sole surviving heir, she needed to either pay them or allow the county to auction the land. She'd stuffed the letter in a drawer and tried to forget about it. 3 more letters had followed, then a phone call, then another. Finally, she'd written the check and made the call. Yes, she'd come up and assess the property. Yes, she understood it was likely unsalvageable. Yes, she'd decide whether to keep it or sell. But the real reason she was here had nothing to do with property taxes or real estate decisions. She was here because she'd spent 35 years not being here, and that absence had carved out a hollow place inside her that no amount of comfortable routine could fill. Fern reached the porch steps and tested the first one with her weight. It held. The second groaned but didn't give way. The third was missing entirely. She stepped over the gap and stood on the porch itself, which creaked and shifted beneath her, but seemed solid enough in the center. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Someone had nailed plywood over the broken window to the left of it years ago, and weather had turned the wood the same grey as everything else. Fern pulled the old key from her pocket. She'd kept it all these years, though she couldn't have said why, and fitted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, and the smell of the past rushed out to meet her, mildew and dust and the particular mustiness of a house that's been closed up too long. Fern stepped inside. The front room was smaller than memory had made it, emptier. Most of the furniture was gone, probably taken by her parents before they died, or sold off afterward. But the stone fireplace still dominated the far wall, and above it, on the mantel, impossibly, sat a single photograph in a warped wooden frame. Fern crossed the room and picked it up with shaking hands. 4 faces looked back at her through dusty glass. Her father, tall and serious in his forestry service uniform. Her mother, pretty and young, smiling the way she used to before everything fell apart. Owen, gangly at 15, all elbows and knees, and that crooked grin that never failed to make people like him. And Fern herself at 12, still thinking the world was mostly good, and that her family would always be whole. The photo had been taken out front, right where she'd just been standing. The house looked solid behind them, freshly painted, the porch straight and strong. Her father's arm rested on Owen's shoulder. Her mother's hand touched Fern's hair. She didn't remember who had taken the picture. A neighbor, probably. Someone passing through. It didn't matter. What mattered was the wholeness of it. The 4 of them together, before the night that split everything into before and after. Fern set the photograph back on the mantel and walked through the rest of the house. The kitchen still had its old cast-iron sink and the avocado green stove her mother had been so proud of. The countertops were warped and water-stained. Animal droppings suggested mice, or possibly raccoons, had moved in. Down the short hallway, 3 doors stood closed. Fern opened the first, her parents' bedroom, empty except for faded wallpaper and a cobweb-draped light fixture. The second, her own room. Smaller than she remembered. A faint rectangular outline on the wall where her bookshelf had been. The third door she hesitated at. Owen's room. She wrapped her fingers around the knob, cold metal against her palm, and turned it. The window in Owen's room faced west, and the late afternoon light slanted in at a low angle, illuminating dust motes that danced and swirled when she pushed the door open. His bed frame was still there, though the mattress had been removed. A small wooden desk stood against one wall. The closet door hung open, empty. Fern walked to the window and looked out at the forest beyond. Owen used to sit here for hours, she remembered, watching birds or reading or just thinking whatever private thoughts 17-year-old boys thought about. He'd been the contemplative one, the one who noticed things. Their father used to say Owen would make a good ranger someday, that he had the patience for it. But Owen never got the chance to be anything. He disappeared 2 months after his 17th birthday, and he never came back. Fern pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself remember that night. It had been June, the mountain summer just beginning. Owen and their father had gotten into an argument after dinner, a bad one, voices raised, their mother trying to smooth things over. Fern had been in her room, door closed, but she'd heard it all. Something about Owen making accusations he couldn't prove. Something about respecting authority. Something about not understanding how the world worked. Owen had stormed out of the house near dusk. She'd heard the screen door slam, heard his footsteps on the porch, and then nothing. He never came home. Their father organized search parties. The sheriff, James Culver, a man Fern remembered as steady and kind, led the investigation. They searched for 3 weeks. Dogs, volunteers, forestry service personnel, everyone. They found no trace, no body, no sign of struggle, nothing. The official conclusion was that Owen had run away, that the argument with their father had been the final straw in some teenage rebellion no one had seen coming, that he'd probably hitched a ride down the mountain and disappeared into some city somewhere, started over, left his old life behind. Fern's mother never believed it. She died 4 years later, heart failure, the doctors said. But Fern knew it was the not knowing that had killed her. Her father followed 18 months after that. Stroke. Sudden. And Fern, who by then was 22 and teaching at a school in Millerton, couldn't bear to come back. Not even for the funerals. She'd sent money for the arrangements and stayed away. She'd been staying away ever since. A bark from outside broke through her thoughts. Boone, reminding her he existed and had his own needs. Fern pushed away from the window and walked back through the house. She'd brought supplies, sleeping bag, camp stove, a cooler with food for a few days. The plan was to stay long enough to sort through whatever remained, make decisions about the property, and then go back to her life in Millerton. A week at most. But standing here now, surrounded by the bones of her childhood, Fern wondered if a week would be enough, if a lifetime would be enough. She found Boone on the front porch, his attention fixed on something beneath the boards. He was pawing at a gap between 2 planks, whining in that particular way that meant he'd found something interesting. "What is it, boy?" Boone glanced back at her, then returned his attention to the porch floor, scratching more insistently now. Fern knelt beside him and peered into the gap. Darkness. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it down. The beam revealed dirt and cobwebs and, there, something that didn't look natural, a straight edge. Metal. "Back up," she told Boone, and he reluctantly moved aside. Fern examined the porch boards more carefully. This section, near the edge by the steps, looked different from the rest. The boards were slightly warped, and there was a gap running in a rectangular shape, as if something had been cut and then laid back down. She went to the truck and retrieved a crowbar from her toolbox. The boards came up easier than she expected, rotted through at the nails. She pried up 3 of them and set them aside. Underneath, set into the ground beneath the porch, was a wooden door. Old, weathered, but deliberately placed. It had an iron ring for a handle. Fern sat back on her heels, heart suddenly pounding. In all the years she'd lived here, she'd never known there was anything under this porch. No one had ever mentioned a cellar or a storage space, or anything else. Boone pressed against her side, also staring down at the door. "Well," Fern said quietly, "I guess we'd better see what's down there." She reached for the iron ring, her fingers closing around metal that was cold and rough with rust. She pulled, and with a groan of wood and earth, the door began to open. The door opened onto stone steps, descending into darkness. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else, something that didn't belong to nature alone. Fern aimed her phone's flashlight down the steps and counted 7 of them before they disappeared into shadow. Boone pressed forward, eager to investigate, but Fern held up a hand. "Wait." She went back to the truck one more time and retrieved a proper flashlight, the heavy-duty kind Paul had always kept in the glove box. When she clicked it on, the beam was strong and steady. She also grabbed a walking stick she'd brought for hiking. Better to have something to test her footing with. At the top of the steps, she paused. Every instinct told her this was foolish. She was alone on a remote mountain property with no cell service, about to climb into an unknown space that had been sealed up for who knew how long. If something happened, if the steps collapsed, if the ceiling caved in, if she fell and broke an ankle, no one would find her for days. But she was also 62 years old and tired of being careful, tired of avoiding hard things. She'd spent more than half her life running from this place and the questions it held. Whatever was down there, she was going to face it. "Stay," she told Boone firmly, then started down. The steps were stone, solid despite their age. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the enclosed space. The walls on either side were also stone, fitted together with old mortar. Someone had built this carefully, deliberately. This wasn't just a hole dug under a porch. This was architecture. At the bottom, the space opened up. Fern swept the flashlight beam around and felt her breath catch. She was standing in a cellar about 12 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that she didn't need to stoop. The walls were the same fitted stone as the stairway. The floor was hard, packed dirt. The air was cold and slightly damp but not foul, and there was no way this space had been here when she was growing up. She would have known. Owen would have found it, used it as a fort or a hideout. Her parents would have mentioned it, stored things in it. Yet here it was, impossible and real. The flashlight beam caught something in the corner. Fern approached slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. Crates, wooden crates stacked against the wall, covered with a tarp that had mostly rotted away. Behind them, a camping lantern sat on the floor, the kind that ran on batteries. Beside it, a folded blanket, and scattered across the dirt floor, footprints, boot prints to be specific, preserved in the fine dust. Fern knelt and examined them more closely. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. Months old, maybe. A year at most. Someone had been down here recently. Someone had used this space. She turned her attention to the crates. The wood was old but intact. She pulled the first one toward her, surprised by its weight. The lid wasn't nailed down, just set in place. She lifted it off and shone her light inside. Clothes. Men's clothes, neatly folded. Flannel shirts, jeans, a heavy canvas jacket. She pulled out one of the shirts and held it up. Large, built for someone tall. She checked the collar. No tag, but the style was dated. 80s, maybe early 90s. The second crate held books, paperbacks mostly, their covers faded and warped, field guides to local flora and fauna, a book about forestry management, several mysteries and westerns. At the bottom, a water-damaged notebook that fell apart when she tried to lift it. The third crate made her hands start shaking. Inside were personal items, a pocket knife with a worn wooden handle, a compass, a canteen, a small box of matches, still dry in their container. And underneath it all, wrapped in a plastic bag, a journal. Fern lifted it out carefully. The journal was bound in dark leather, about the size of a paperback book, maybe 100 pages. The leather was water-stained and cracked with age, but the bag had protected it from the worst of the moisture. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting hit her like a physical blow. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on birthday cards and school assignments, and notes left on the kitchen table. She'd seen it in the margins of the books they'd shared, and on the grocery lists her mother used to send them to town with. Owen's handwriting. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard and forced herself to focus on the words. The first entry was dated October 14th, 1995, 7 years after Owen disappeared. 7 years after she'd last seen him, after the searches ended, after their mother died, still believing he'd come back someday. Fern sank down onto the dirt floor, journal clutched in both hands, and began to read. October 14th, 1995. I'm back. Never thought I'd come back to this mountain. But here I am. Built the cellar myself over the past month. Dad never knew about the original foundation under the porch. I found it when I was 15, old hand-dug storage from when the house was first built. Made it bigger, deeper, shored it up proper. No one will find it unless they know to look. I can't stay at the house itself. Too visible. But I can't leave either. Not yet. Not until I have proof. Saw him yesterday, just like before. Same truck, same time of night. He's still doing it. Still taking what isn't his. And someone's still protecting him. This time I'll get the evidence. This time I won't go to the wrong people. Fern read the entry twice, then flipped forward through the journal. Dozens of entries, spanning what looked like several months, all in Owen's hand, all documenting something. Observations, times, descriptions, references to him, and they, and the operation. She turned to a random page in the middle. November 8th, 1995. Followed the trucks to the depot tonight. Got close enough to see the license plates. Took photos, but the light was bad. Need better equipment. VP was there, directing everything. Bold as brass. Doesn't think anyone's watching anymore. Doesn't think anyone cares. But I care. I've always cared. That's why they ran me off in the first place. Found where they're cutting now. Deep in the federal section. Nowhere near any authorized sites. Taking old growth, the kind that won't grow back in our lifetimes. Dad would be sick if he knew. But Dad never knew. Dad believed what they told him. I won't make that mistake again. VP. Fern's mind raced. Vernon Pike. It had to be. Pike had been a local contractor, she remembered, always around when she was young. He'd done work for various people in the county. Her father had known him, though she couldn't remember them being particularly friendly. She flipped to the end of the journal. The final entry was brief, the handwriting more hurried than the rest. December 3rd, 1995. Tonight. It's happening tonight. They're doing a big haul. I heard them planning it at the diner. I've got the camera set up at the site. I'll finally have everything I need. After tonight, I can go to the state authorities. Not the locals. Never the locals again. I learned that lesson. If something goes wrong, the evidence is in the metal box, buried at the coordinates I marked on the map. The map's in the second crate. If you're reading this, whoever you are, finish what I started. Don't let them get away with it. That was the last entry. The page after it was blank. All the pages after it were blank. Fern sat in the cold cellar, Owen's journal in her lap, and felt 35 years of carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Owen had been alive. For 7 years after he disappeared, he'd been alive. He'd come back here, to this mountain, to their family's land, and he'd been trying to prove something, trying to expose something, and then he'd stopped writing. The December 3rd entry was dated 7 years after his disappearance, which meant it had been written 28 years ago. Fern had been 24 then, teaching in Millerton, already trying to build a life separate from the mountain and its losses. She'd never known he was here. never sensed it, never imagined it. She looked around the cellar again with new understanding. This was Owen's refuge, his base. He'd built it himself, hidden it perfectly, and used it while he investigated whatever he'd been investigating. Vernon Pike. Illegal logging, from the sound of it. Theft of timber from federal land. And someone protecting him. Someone local, someone in authority. Owen had discovered it before, when he was 17. That's what the argument with their father had been about. And then he'd disappeared. Run off, everyone said. But now Fern wondered if he'd been driven off, threatened, scared away by people who didn't want their operation exposed, and then he'd come back, 7 years later. Older, more careful. Trying again. She thought about that last entry. Tonight. The camera. The evidence. What had happened that night, December 3rd, 1995? Fern looked at the other crates. Owen had mentioned a map in the second crate. She opened it again and searched more carefully this time. At the very bottom, folded beneath the damaged notebook, she found it. A surveyor's map of the property and surrounding forest land, protected in a plastic sleeve. She pulled it out and spread it on the ground. Owen had marked it extensively in pencil. X's and circles and notes in the margins, coordinates, dates, and in the lower corner, circled heavily. Metal box, evidence. Fern refolded the map with shaking hands and stood up. Boone's worried face appeared at the top of the stairs, backlit by the fading afternoon light. "I'm okay," she called up to him, though she wasn't sure it was true. She gathered the journal and the map and climbed back up into the dying day. She needed to think. She needed to understand what Owen had been doing and what had happened to him. But first, she needed to find that metal box. Fern built a fire in the stone fireplace that night, more for comfort than warmth, though the mountain cold was already seeping through the walls. She'd set up her camp in the front room, sleeping bag near the hearth, cooler and supplies in the kitchen, Boone's bed beside her own. The dog lay with his head on his paws, watching her with those dark, understanding eyes. She'd made tea on her camp stove, something her mother used to do when problems felt too big to face straight on. Make tea, sit down, think it through. It was a small ritual, but it steadied her hands and gave her mind something to focus on besides the weight of what she'd discovered. The journal lay open on her lap. She'd been reading and rereading entries for the past 2 hours, trying to piece together the story Owen had been documenting. The fire crackled and shifted, throwing shadows across the pages. Owen's voice came through clearly in the writing, methodical, determined, occasionally frustrated. He'd been watching someone, documenting their movements and activities. Vernon Pike, almost certainly, though Owen had been careful to use only initials in most entries. VP and sometimes just V. The operation Owen described was straightforward enough. Illegal timber harvesting on federal forest land. Pike would go in at night with a crew and equipment, cut old-growth trees, and truck them out to buyers who didn't ask too many questions. It was theft, pure and simple, but on a scale large enough to be profitable and systematic enough to require planning and protection. That protection. That was the part that had cost Owen everything. Fern turned to an entry from late October 1995. October 28th, 1995. Confirmed today what I suspected 8 years ago. VP isn't working alone. He couldn't be. The Forest Service would have caught him by now if he didn't have someone running interference. Watched the checkpoint on Route 47 tonight. 3 trucks came through, loaded with fresh-cut logs. The ranger on duty, Thompson, I think his name was, didn't even slow them down, just waved them through like they were hauling groceries. Dad used to say Thompson was solid, reliable, But Dad believed everyone in the service was clean. That was his mistake. That's why he didn't believe me the first time. I was 17 and stupid. I went straight to the sheriff after I saw VP cutting in the protected zone. Thought that's what you were supposed to do. See a crime, report it. Simple. Sheriff Culver took my statement real serious. Wrote it all down. Told me he'd look into it. Told me not to mention it to anyone else while he investigated. 2 days later, Dad pulled me aside. Said he'd heard I'd been making serious accusations without proof. Said I needed to understand how the world worked, that I couldn't just go around claiming people were criminals based on what I thought I'd seen in the dark. I told him I'd been to the sheriff. He said the sheriff had told him there was nothing to my story, that I'd probably just seen a legitimate operation and gotten confused. That's when I knew Culver was dirty. Had to be. He'd gone straight to Dad instead of investigating. Tried to make it go away. I pushed back. Told Dad I knew what I'd seen. We fought. Worst fight we'd ever had. That night, after I stormed out, someone found me on the trail. Not to talk. To warn. I don't remember much about it. Just hands grabbing me, voices telling me to keep my mouth shut, to leave town, to forget everything. And then I was on the ground, and they were gone, and I was too scared and too angry to go back home. So I didn't. I hitched a ride down the mountain and I kept going. Spent 7 years trying to forget this place. But you can't forget. Not really. Some things follow you. Fern closed her eyes. All these years, she'd believed Owen had run away because of the argument with their father. A teenage rebellion, an impulsive decision. The not knowing had been terrible, but at least it had been explainable. Kids ran away. Sometimes they didn't come back. But this was different. Owen had been threatened, driven off, probably hurt from the sound of it, and he'd spent 7 years away, building a life somewhere else, probably trying to convince himself it didn't matter. Until he came back. She turned to another entry, this one from early November. November 3rd, 1995. The worst part isn't that they're stealing from federal land. It's not even the money they're making. It's what they're destroying. Went to the cutting site today, the one I marked on the map. Old-growth Douglas fir. Some of them 300 years old. Ancient trees that were here before any of us. That would be here long after. VP's crew took down maybe 30 of them. Just cut them down, hauled them out, left the forest looking like a war zone. The erosion's already starting. By spring, that whole slope will be unstable. Dad spent his whole career trying to protect these forests. He believed in the work, in the idea that we were stewards of something bigger than ourselves. He believed the system worked. If he'd known what was really happening, if he'd believed me when I tried to tell him, it would have broken his heart. Maybe it's better he never knew. Maybe that's a mercy. But I know, and I can't unknow it. So I'm going to document everything, gather evidence that can't be ignored or dismissed, and then I'm going to take it to someone who'll actually do something about it. Not the local sheriff, not local authorities at all, state level, federal if I have to. They're not going to silence me this time. Fern felt tears sliding down her face. She didn't bother wiping them away. Owen had been trying to finish what he'd started, trying to protect something their father had cared about deeply, trying to do the right thing, and somewhere along the way he'd disappeared again, this time permanently. She flipped through more pages, reading about Owen's surveillance efforts. He'd been patient and thorough. He'd documented dates, times, license plate numbers. He'd photographed equipment and trucks. He'd tracked the timber from cutting site to depot to buyers. The entries grew more confident as November progressed. Owen believed he was close to having everything he needed. And then came that final entry on December 3rd. Tonight. The camera, the evidence in the metal box. Fern looked at the surveyor's map spread out beside her. Owen had marked several locations in the forest surrounding the property. Most were labelled with dates and brief notes. Primary cutting site, access road, loading point. But one mark, circled multiple times, just had coordinates and a single word: evidence. That's where the metal box would be. Had to be. She studied the coordinates, trying to orient herself. The location was maybe 2 miles into the forest, off any established trail. In an area she vaguely remembered from childhood hikes. There'd been a small creek there, she thought, and a distinctive rock formation. Tomorrow she'd go look for it. Tonight, she needed to finish reading the journal, see if there were any other clues she'd missed. But as she turned back to the earlier entries, a thought struck her. Owen had been documenting an illegal operation involving Vernon Pike and at least one corrupt official, Sheriff Culver, based on what Owen had written. 8 years ago, when Fern had left, both men had still been around. Pike had been running his contractor business. Culver had been the county sheriff. Were they still here? Still alive? Fern pulled out her phone. No signal, but she could use it to make notes. Tomorrow, when she went into town for supplies, she'd find out what had happened to Vernon Pike and James Culver in the years since Owen had written that final entry. She had a feeling the answers wouldn't be comforting. Boone shifted position and sighed heavily, a sound of contentment despite the strangeness of their surroundings. Fern reached out and scratched behind his ears. "We're going to figure this out," she told him quietly. "Whatever happened to Owen, we're going to find the truth." The dog's tail thumped against the floor twice, acceptance and trust. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and whistling through gaps in the walls. The fire burned lower. Fern added another log and watched the flames catch and spread. Her brother had come back to this mountain to finish something important. He'd been brave and determined, and probably more than a little reckless. She was going to finish what he'd started. Morning came cold and bright. Fern woke to frost on the windows, and Boone's nose pressed against her sleeping bag, his way of saying it was past time for breakfast. She fed him first, then made herself coffee and oatmeal on the camp stove, while her mind worked through everything she'd learned. The metal box Owen had mentioned. That was the key. If he'd buried evidence there, that evidence might still exist. Documents, photographs, proof of the illegal operation and who was behind it. After breakfast, she gathered what she'd need. The surveyor's map, her compass, water, a day pack with basic supplies. The coordinates Owen had marked would take her deep enough into the forest that she wanted to be prepared. She also took the journal, though she'd read it cover to cover twice now. Something about having it with her felt right, like bringing Owen along. Before heading into the woods, though, she returned to the cellar. There might be more items she'd missed in last night's dim flashlight beam. In full daylight, with better lighting, she could search more thoroughly. She descended the stone steps carefully, this time with a battery-powered lantern that threw strong white light into every corner. Boone came with her, his claws clicking on stone. The cellar looked different in bright light, less mysterious, more utilitarian. Just a room someone had built for a purpose. She went through the crates again, removing everything and examining each item carefully. In the first crate, beneath the clothes, she found a small tool kit. Screwdrivers, pliers, wire cutters. Nothing unusual. In the second crate, under all the books, she discovered a plastic bag containing batteries. Corroded now, useless, and a small notebook with weather observations, Owen documenting patterns, probably trying to predict when Pike's crew would be working. The third crate yielded more. At the very bottom, wrapped in a trash bag, she found camping equipment, a compact sleeping bag, a ground pad, a small camping stove similar to the one she'd brought herself. Owen had been prepared for long surveillances. And beneath all that, something that made her pause. A metal lock box, smaller than a shoebox, with a combination lock. Fern lifted it out carefully. It was heavy, solid. She tried the lock, but it didn't budge. She carried it upstairs into better light and examined it more closely. The metal was scratched and dented, like it had been knocked around some. But it was intact. She tried a few obvious combinations. Owen's birthday, their parents' anniversary, her own birthday. None of them worked. She thought about the journal entries, looking for number patterns or dates that might be significant. December 3rd, 1995, the last entry date. She tried 120395. The lock didn't open. She tried the date of Owen's disappearance, June 18th, 1988. No luck. Then she remembered something from childhood, their grandfather's old pocket watch, the one Owen had inherited. It had been engraved with a date, their grandparents' wedding date. Owen had been fascinated by it, carried it everywhere. June 7th, 1942. She tried 0600742. The lock clicked open. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic, were more items. A small camera, the kind that used film, which told her how old this cache was. A notebook filled with more of Owen's observations. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the cutting sites, with dates and estimated volumes noted beside each location. And at the bottom, a surveyor's map, a different one from what she'd found in the crate. This one was marked more extensively, with notes in Owen's careful handwriting. Multiple sites circled and labelled, routes marked in coloured pencil, and one location marked with a star instead of an X, deep in the federal forest. No label, just the star and coordinates. Fern compared this map to the one she'd found yesterday. The coordinates for the metal box were clearly marked on both, but this starred location was only on the newer map, the one from the locked box. What made it special? Why mark it differently? She studied Owen's notes on the rest of the map. The cutting sites were all marked with X's and dates. Access roads were drawn in blue. The depot where Pike apparently took the stolen timber was circled in red. But the starred location had nothing around it. No notes, no dates, no explanation. Fern folded both maps carefully and packed them in her day pack along with the journal, the camera, and the notebook. Then she looked at Boone. "You ready for a hike?" His tail wagged enthusiastically. They set out mid-morning, the sun climbing toward its low winter arc. Fern locked the house behind her, more out of habit than any real belief that someone might come by, and headed into the forest. The woods were quieter than she remembered. Fewer birds, maybe, or maybe just the season. Her boots crunched through frost-stiffened leaves. Boone ranged ahead, nose down, investigating everything. She used the compass and the coordinates Owen had marked, orienting herself by landmarks she half remembered. That granite, outcropping. She'd climbed on that as a child. The twisted oak struck by lightning. It was bigger now, but still recognizable. The landscape held memory even when she'd tried to forget it. The first location, marked with an X on Owen's map, was about a mile in. When she reached it, she understood immediately what she was looking at. The forest here was different. Younger trees, all roughly the same age, growing in what had clearly once been a clearing. Stumps, old and weathered, still visible beneath the undergrowth. This had been one of Pike's cutting sites. The forest was recovering, as forests do, but you could still see the damage if you knew to look for it. The spacing was wrong, the variety limited. It would take another century for this place to return to what it had been. Fern took photos with her phone, documenting what she saw, though she knew the images wouldn't mean much to anyone who hadn't seen old-growth forest before the cutting. She moved on to the second marked location. Similar story. Clear evidence of old logging. Trees all the wrong age growing in regimented rows where ancient forest had once stood. The third site was different. Here she found something Owen had left behind. Deliberately, she thought. A cairn of stones, carefully stacked, with a plastic bag tucked underneath. Inside the bag, photographs. She pulled them out carefully. The photos were old, colors faded, but the images were clear enough. Trucks loaded with logs, men working in the darkness, floodlights illuminating the scene, license plates visible on some of the vehicles, and in one photo, 2 men standing together near a truck. One she didn't recognize, the other she did, even after all these years. Vernon Pike. Older in the photo than she remembered him, but unmistakably him. The same broad shoulders, the same way of standing with his weight on one leg. Fern's hands trembled as she tucked the photographs back into the plastic bag and then into a pack. Owen had documented everything. He'd been patient and thorough and smart about it. So what had gone wrong? She checked her compass and the coordinates for the metal box. Still another half-mile, deeper into the forest, toward the creek she remembered from childhood. The trees grew denser as she walked, the forest floor thick with fallen needles and ferns. A jay scolded from somewhere overhead. Boone found a scent trail and followed it for a while before returning to her side. Finally, she reached the coordinates. A small clearing beside the creek, just as she'd remembered. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. On the far side of the creek, a distinctive rock formation. 3 large boulders leaning against each other like old friends. Fern crossed the creek carefully, stepping from stone to stone, and approached the boulders. If Owen had buried something here, where would it be? She walked slowly around the formation, studying the ground. There, on the north side, protected from weather by the overhang of the largest boulder. A slight depression in the earth, oval-shaped, about 2 feet long. She knelt and began to dig with her hands, carefully moving aside pine needles and soil. 6 inches down, her fingers hit something solid. Metal. She cleared away more dirt until she could see it clearly. A metal ammunition box, the kind military surplus stores sold. Waterproof, sturdy, perfect for protecting something important. Fern pulled it free and sat back on her heels, breathing hard. This was it. This was the evidence Owen had been willing to die for. She opened the latches and lifted the lid. Inside the metal box, protected by layers of plastic bags, were documents, receipts, ledgers, photographs, and handwritten notes, all carefully organized and labeled in Owen's meticulous script. Fern lifted out the first bundle. Receipts from a timber broker in a town 3 counties over, dated throughout 1995. Each receipt listed quantities, wood types, and dollar amounts. The numbers were substantial. Thousands of dollars per transaction, multiple transactions per month. Someone had been moving a lot of timber through that broker. The next bundle contained what looked like copies of Forestry Service reports. Owen had somehow obtained official documentation showing which areas were designated for logging and which were protected. He'd highlighted the protected zones in yellow and marked corresponding locations on a detailed topographical map. Then came the photographs. These were different from the ones she'd found at the cairn, more professional, better lit, showing clear evidence of cutting in the protected zones. Timestamps on the backs indicated they'd been taken over several months in late 1995. Owen had been systematic, documenting the entire operation from multiple angles. But it was the final item in the box that made Fern's blood run cold. A photograph of two men standing beside a truck, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a hidden position. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Vernon Pike on the left, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, and on the right, in a sheriff's uniform, James Culver. They weren't just standing near each other. Culver was handing Pike something that looked like documents, and Pike was handing Culver what was clearly an envelope, the kind that usually contained cash. Owen had captured proof of the corruption. Not just the illegal logging, but the payoff that made it possible. Fern sat beside the creek for a long time, the evidence spread out on the ground around her, trying to understand what it meant. Owen had gathered all of this 28 years ago. He'd been ready to expose Pike and Culver, to bring down the entire operation. And then he'd vanished. The timeline was clear now. Owen's last journal entry was December 3rd, 1995. That was the night he'd planned to get final evidence, probably more photographs of a large timber haul. He'd mentioned setting up a camera at the site. He never wrote another entry after that. Fern carefully repacked everything into the metal box and secured it in her backpack. This evidence was nearly 3 decades old, but it was still proof of crimes that had been committed. Whether anyone could be prosecuted now was another question. Statute of limitations, the challenge of proving current relevance, the fact that one of the main players was long dead. But that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was finding out what had happened to Owen, and this evidence suggested a clear motive for someone to want him silenced. She stood and brushed dirt from her jeans. Boone had been patient, lying in a patch of sun while she'd worked. But now he got to his feet, ready to move on. "Come on, boy. We're not done yet." There was still the starred location on the second map to investigate. The place Owen had marked, but never labeled. Something told her that location was important. Maybe the most important. According to the coordinates, it was another 1.5 miles northwest, deeper into federal land. Fern checked her compass and started walking. The forest changed as she went, growing older and denser. These trees hadn't been cut in her lifetime or her father's. Some of them were probably 300 or 400 years old, the kind of old-growth timber that Pike had been harvesting illegally, the kind worth a fortune to the right buyer. She climbed a ridge, descended into a hollow, crossed another creek. The starred location was in rough country, the kind of place you wouldn't stumble across unless you were looking for it. Finally, after nearly an hour of hiking, she checked her coordinates again. Close. Very close. She climbed up a small rise and found herself looking down into a natural depression, almost like a shallow bowl carved into the mountainside. The trees here were massive, Douglas firs with trunks wider than she could wrap her arms around. The ground was carpeted with ferns and moss. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. And it was wrong. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The trees at the center of the depression were younger than the ones surrounding it. Not dramatically younger, but enough that someone who knew trees could tell. Maybe 50 or 60 years old instead of 300 or 400, which meant this area had been clear-cut once, probably in the 1940s or 1950s, and had since grown back. But why would Owen mark this location? What made it significant to his investigation of Pike's operation in the 1990s? Fern descended carefully into the depression, Boone staying close. The ground was soft with decades of fallen needles. She walked slowly through the younger trees, looking for... what? She wasn't sure. Then Boone stopped and began to dig, his front paws working frantically at the soil. "What is it?" She knelt beside him and helped move the dirt. A few inches down, Her fingers hit something that wasn't earth or stone. Fabric, rotted and fragile. She brushed more carefully now, uncovering what looked like the remains of a canvas tarp. Beneath the tarp, partially buried and badly deteriorated, bones. Fern jerked her hand back, heart hammering. She forced herself to look more closely. Animal bones, she realized after a moment. A deer, probably, that had died here and been covered by natural accumulation of forest debris. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard. But then Boone moved to another spot a few feet away and began digging again. And this time, when Fern helped uncover what he'd found, she saw something that made her blood freeze. A boot. Old, rotted, but unmistakably human-made. And inside the boot, small bones, the bones of a human foot. Fern scrambled backward, bile rising in her throat. Boone whined and backed away from the hole, sensing her distress. She sat there for a long moment, unable to move, unable to think beyond the immediate shock of what she'd discovered. Then, slowly, her mind began to work again. A body. Someone had been buried here, hidden here. Owen had marked this location with a star, different from all the other marks on his map. Special. Had Owen known there was a body here? Had he found it during his investigation? Or, and this thought made her feel sick, was this Owen himself? She forced herself to look at the partially exposed boot again. It was large, meant for a man. The leather was completely degraded, but she could see it had been a work boot, the kind someone doing outdoor labor would wear, the kind Owen would have worn. But she couldn't be sure. Not without excavating further, and she wasn't going to do that. This was potentially a crime scene. If this was a body, if this was Owen, it needed to be handled properly by authorities. Fern pulled out her phone to take photographs, documenting the location and what she'd found, even though she had no signal to send them anywhere. Her hands shook so badly the first few images were blurred. She steadied herself and tried again. Then she carefully covered the exposed boot with the tarp and some of the disturbed soil, trying to restore the site to something close to how they'd found it. Boone watched her work, sitting quietly now, understanding somehow that something serious had happened. When she finished, Fern sat down heavily on a fallen log and tried to think clearly. She was miles from her truck, deep in federal forest land, with evidence of what might be a decades-old murder. She needed to get back to the house, figure out where she could get cell service, and call the authorities. But which authorities? If Culver had been corrupt, had others been involved too? The Forestry Service, based on what Owen had written about the ranger waving Pike's trucks through? Local police? She needed to be smart about this. Owen had learned the hard way what happened when you went to the wrong people with information like this. Fern stood, shouldered her pack with its cargo of evidence, and started the long hike back. Boone stayed close, glancing up at her every few minutes, as if checking that she was okay. She wasn't okay, but she was determined, and she was finally close to understanding what had happened to her brother 35 years ago. By the time Fern made it back to the house, the sun was dropping toward the ridgeline, and her legs were trembling with exhaustion. She'd pushed hard on the return hike, driven by a need to get away from that hollow in the forest and what it might contain. She fed Boone and then stood at the kitchen sink, drinking water and staring out at the darkening woods. Her mind kept returning to that boot, those small bones. She'd seen death before, Paul's long decline, her parents' final days, but this was different. This was violence hidden and left to rot. If that body was Owen's, and she believed in her gut that it was, then everything made terrible sense. He'd gone out on the night of December 3rd, 1995, to photograph Pike's logging operation. Someone had caught him, and instead of just running him off again, this time they'd made sure he couldn't come back. Fern pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos she'd taken. The boot, the disturbed earth, the location markers she'd carefully documented. She had GPS coordinates, time-stamped images, and a clear record of what she'd found. But she still had no cell service. The mountain had always been a dead zone for phones. Too remote, too many ridges blocking signal. To make any calls, she'd need to drive down to Millerton, at least an hour away. She looked at the sky. Dark was coming fast, and she didn't trust herself to drive those mountain roads after the day she'd had. Better to wait until morning. One more night wouldn't change anything. Instead, she turned her attention back to the evidence she'd found in the metal box. She spread it out on the floor near the fireplace and examined each piece carefully, looking for details she might have missed. The receipts from the timber broker were dated September through November 1995. The amounts were staggering, over $50,000 in total across just 3 months. Pike had been running a sophisticated operation, moving timber regularly to a buyer who either didn't care about its origin or had been paid not to ask questions. The Forestry Service documents Owen had obtained showed protection designations for specific parcels of federal land. Someone inside the service had to have given him these, a sympathetic employee, maybe, or Owen had figured out how to access them himself. Either way, they proved definitively that Pike had been cutting in areas that were legally off-limits. The photographs of Pike and Culver together were damning. Even after nearly 3 decades, you could see the transaction clearly. Money for protection. A sheriff taking bribes to look the other way while federal land was plundered. Fern thought about her father, who'd worked for the Forestry Service his entire adult life. He'd believed in the mission deeply, managing resources responsibly, protecting what needed protecting, planning for generations to come. If he'd known about Pike's operation, it would have devastated him. But according to Owen's journal, their father hadn't believed him. When Owen had tried to report what he'd seen at 17, their father had dismissed it, had told him he didn't understand how things worked. Why? Had he truly not believed Owen could tell the difference between legal and illegal logging? Or had there been something else? Some reason he couldn't or wouldn't act on the information? Fern pulled out Owen's journal and reread the relevant entries. Owen had been angry, but not entirely surprised by their father's reaction. He'd written about making accusations without proof, about needing to understand how the world worked. And then there was the mention of Culver telling their father about Owen's report. That had been the moment Owen realized the sheriff was corrupt. But what about their father? Had he been willfully blind? Or had he known more than Owen realized? She thought back to that last terrible summer when Owen disappeared. She'd been 17, caught up in her own teenage concerns, not paying much attention to adult tensions. But there had been something, hadn't there? Some worry hanging over the house that she'd been too young to fully understand. Her father had been quieter than usual that spring. Distracted. She remembered him and their mother having hushed conversations that stopped when she or Owen entered the room. At the time, she'd assumed it was work stress or financial worries, the normal concerns of parents trying to keep a household running. Now she wondered if it had been something else. Had her father known about the corruption? Had he been facing some kind of choice or pressure? The fire crackled and settled. Fern added another log and watched sparks spiral up the chimney. Outside, an owl called, and Boone's ears perked up before he settled back down. She picked up the second map, the one from the lockbox, and studied the starred location again. Owen had marked it separately for a reason. He must have found something there, or known something was there, before his final night. Had he discovered the body before December 3rd? Was that part of what he'd meant to document that night? Or had he suspected that's where he would end up if things went wrong? That thought made her chest tighten. Owen, knowing the danger, but going forward anyway because he believed in doing the right thing, just like he'd tried to do at 17 before he'd learned how corrupt the system could be. Fern stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark forest. Tomorrow she'd drive to Millerton and figure out her next steps. She'd need to contact state police, probably, given the evidence of local corruption. She'd need to report the potential burial site and turn over Owen's documentation. But tonight, she had one more thing she needed to understand. She went back to the cellar with her flashlight, descending the stone steps carefully. The space felt different now, less like a hidden refuge, and more like evidence of Owen's determination. He'd built this place himself, created a base from which to investigate, documented everything methodically. She searched the corners she hadn't examined closely before. In one, she found more camping supplies, a water filtration system, freeze-dried food packets with expiration dates from 1996, a small first aid kit. Owen had been prepared for long-term surveillance work. In another corner, partially hidden behind one of the crates, she found something she'd missed before. A small wooden box, handmade, simple joinery. She lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside was a pocket watch on a silver chain. The watch face was cracked, the hand stopped at 9:47. She turned it over and read the engraving on the back. To J.T. and M.L., June 7th, 1942. Their grandparents' wedding date. Their grandfather's watch, the one Owen had inherited and treasured. Beside the watch was a folded piece of paper. Fern opened it carefully. It was a letter, written in Owen's handwriting, addressed to whoever finds this. Her hands trembled as she began to read. If you're reading this, something went wrong. I knew the risks when I came back to this mountain, but some things are worth the risk. By now you've probably found the evidence I've been gathering. Pike and Culver have been running an illegal logging operation in the federal forest for years, maybe decades. They're stealing old-growth timber worth millions, destroying protected habitat, and lining their pockets with the proceeds. I tried to stop them once before, when I was 17. I was naive then. I thought you just reported crimes and the system took care of the rest. But the system was broken. Culver was dirty, and there were others protecting the operation too. They made sure I understood what would happen if I didn't leave town. So I left. I spent 7 years trying to convince myself it didn't matter, that one person couldn't make a difference anyway. But I couldn't let it go. This forest belonged to my father and grandfather before him. They devoted their lives to protecting it. And even if Dad couldn't or wouldn't see what was happening, I could. I had to try again. This time I've been smarter. I've documented everything. The evidence is buried at the coordinates marked on the map. If you're reading this, please finish what I started. Take the evidence to the state authorities, not local. Never local. And if I'm gone, tell my family I'm sorry. Tell Fern I love her, that I thought about her every day I was away. Tell Mum and Dad I was trying to do the right thing. Some truths are worth dying for. This forest is one of them. Owen Talcott, December 3rd, 1995. Fern read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Owen had known he might not survive. He'd written this letter as a precaution, left the watch as identification, made sure someone would be able to finish his work, and then he'd gone out into the night to get the final piece of evidence he needed. And he'd never come back. She sat in the cold cellar, clutching the letter and the watch, and let herself finally, fully grieve for the brother she'd lost 35 years ago. Not to some impulsive decision to run away. Not to teenage rebellion or wanderlust. To murder. Killed for trying to protect something worth protecting. Tomorrow she'd make sure Owen's death meant something. Tomorrow she'd finish what he'd started. Tonight, she'd let herself cry. Fern left the mountain at first light, Owen's letter and pocket watch sealed in a plastic bag in her backpack, along with all the other evidence. The drive down to Millerton took an hour and a half, the truck winding through switchbacks and finally emerging into the broader valley where cell service flickered back to life. She pulled into a diner parking lot and sat for a moment, organizing her thoughts. She needed to report what she'd found, but she also needed to understand the current situation. Were Pike and Culver still around? Were there others involved who might still pose a threat? Inside the diner, she ordered coffee and asked to borrow the phone book. The waitress, a woman about Fern's age with kind eyes, brought her a worn copy. "You okay, hun? You look like you've had a rough night." "Just dealing with some family business," Fern said. "Been up at the old property on the mountain." "Oh, you're Fern Talcott. I heard someone was finally dealing with that place. I'm Beth Riley. We went to school together, though you probably don't remember me." Fern looked up, really seeing the woman now. Beth Riley. Yes, she did remember. A quiet girl 2 grades below her, always had her nose in a book. "I remember," Fern said. "It's good to see you, Beth. You too. Listen, if you need anything while you're in town, you just ask. I know coming back here can't be easy, with what happened to your brother and all." Fern's hands stilled on the phone book. "What do people say happened to Owen?" Beth glanced around the diner, only 2 other customers, both absorbed in their newspapers. She slid into the booth across from Fern and lowered her voice. "Honestly, most folks think he ran off after that fight with your dad. But there were always rumors, you know. Some people said he got mixed up in something he shouldn't have. Others said maybe he'd been in an accident out in the woods and nobody ever found him." She paused. "My dad was one of the volunteers who searched for him. He always thought there was more to the story than what Sheriff Culver said." "Your dad's still around?" "Passed away 6 years ago. Heart attack." Beth's expression grew more serious. "But before he died, he told me something he'd never mentioned before. Said he and some of the other searchers found evidence of fresh digging in a remote part of the forest, like someone had been out there with a shovel recently. When they reported it to Culver, he said it was probably just teenagers messing around, told them not to waste time on it. My dad always wondered if they'd been told to stop searching before they found something they weren't supposed to find." Fern felt her pulse quicken. "Did your dad remember where this digging was?" "Not exactly. Somewhere in the federal land northwest of your family's property. Real remote." Beth studied Fern's face. "Did you find something up there?" Fern made a quick decision. "I need to know. Is Vernon Pike still alive?" Beth's eyes widened slightly. "Pike? Sure, he's alive. Lives over in Colton County now. Has for years. Must be in his mid-70s by now. Why? What about James Culver? The old sheriff? He died maybe 5 years ago. Cancer." Beth leaned forward. "Fern, what's going on?" "I found evidence," Fern said quietly. "Evidence that Owen was murdered. And I think I know where he's buried." Beth's hand went to her mouth. "Oh my God, are you sure?" "I need to report it to the state police, not local authorities. Can you tell me, who's the sheriff here now? Are they trustworthy?" "Sheriff Martinez? Yeah, she's good. Came in from outside the county about 10 years ago. Cleaned house. Got rid of all the old-timers who'd been running things their way for too long. She's honest, far as anyone can tell. Beth paused. But if you're talking about something that happened 30 years ago and involves the old sheriff, state police might be better. Less conflict of interest. Fern nodded. She pulled out her phone and searched for the state police barracks nearest to Millerton. Found a number, called, and asked to speak to someone about a cold case. They transferred her 3 times before she got a detective who listened to her story without interrupting. His name was Detective Marcus Webb, and his voice was calm and professional. "Ma'am, I need you to stay where you are. I'm about 45 minutes out. Don't go back to that site. Don't disturb anything else. Can you do that?" "I can. I'm at the Millerton Diner." "I know it. Order breakfast. Take your time. I'll be there as soon as I can." While she waited, Fern used her phone to search for information about Vernon Pike. It didn't take long to find him. There was a Vernon Pike listed in Colton County, same age range, same general background. He'd been a contractor, now retired. There was even a photo from a local newspaper article about a community project he'd donated to 3 years ago. The same broad shoulders, the same stance. Older, greyer, but unmistakably the man from Owen's photographs. He was living free, probably comfortable, while Owen had been dead in the ground for 28 years. Detective Webb arrived exactly 43 minutes later. He was in his 50s, black, with steel-grey hair and the kind of steady presence that made you trust him. Fern showed him everything: the journal, the maps, the evidence from the metal box, Owen's final letter, the photographs she'd taken at the burial site. Webb examined each item carefully, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. His expression grew grimmer as the scope of what she was showing him became clear. "This is substantial," he said finally. "You've essentially handed me a complete case file. The corruption, the illegal operation, the probable murder. It's all here. The question is going to be what we can still prosecute after nearly 3 decades. "Vernon Pike is still alive," Fern said. "I found him. He's living in Colton County." Webb nodded slowly. "That's good to know. Murder has no statute of limitations. If we can prove he killed your brother or was involved in his death, we can still charge him." "What about the others? The ranger who waved the trucks through? Anyone else who was involved?" "We'll investigate thoroughly. Your brother documented names and dates. That gives us starting points." Webb looked at Owen's letter again. "Your brother was brave and thorough. He gave us a chance to get justice for him, even 28 years later." They spent another hour going over details. Webb called for a forensics team to meet him at the burial site, asked Fern to guide them to the exact location. She agreed, though the thought of going back there made her stomach turn. As they were preparing to leave, Beth came over with a fresh pot of coffee. "Fern, there's something else you should know. About Culver." Detective Webb looked up sharply. "What about him?" Beth hesitated, then committed. "A few months before he died, Culver came in here regular. He'd sit in that corner booth and drink coffee for hours, just staring out the window. One day, when I brought him his check, he said something strange. He said, 'Some mistakes you can never fix, no matter how long you live. You just have to carry them.'" She paused, remembering. "I asked him what he meant, trying to be friendly, you know. And he said, 'I made someone carry a burden they never should have had to carry.' Someone who was just trying to do the right thing." Then he paid his bill and left. He never came back after that. Died maybe a week later. Webb was writing quickly. "Did he mention any names?" "No, but I always wondered." She looked at Fern. I wondered if he was talking about Owen. The forensics team met them at the site 3 hours later. Fern led them to the depression in the forest, showed them exactly where Boone had found the boot. The team leader, a woman named Dr. Chen, took control immediately, establishing a perimeter and beginning careful excavation. "This will take time," she told Fern. "Could be a day or two before we can confirm identity and cause of death. You should go home. Let us work." But Fern couldn't leave. She sat on a fallen log at the edge of the perimeter, Boone beside her, and watched them work. Watched them carefully brush away soil, document every finding, treat the site with the respect it deserved. By late afternoon, they'd confirmed it was a human burial, male based on the size and structure of the remains. Dr. Chen estimated he'd been in his late teens or early 20s when he died, and in the soil near the ribcage, they found something that made Fern's breath catch: a camera. Old, rusted, but still recognizable. The kind that used film. The kind Owen had mentioned in his final journal entry. "We'll process everything at the lab," Dr. Chen said gently. "Dental records, if we can find them, will give us positive identification. DNA, if necessary. But," she looked at Fern with compassion, "based on the evidence you've provided and what we're finding here, I'd say you've found your brother." Fern nodded, unable to speak. She'd known, of course, had known from the moment she'd seen that boot. But hearing it confirmed was different. Owen had been here all along, just a few miles from the house where he'd grown up, on land their family had owned for generations. He'd tried to protect this forest, and he'd died for it, and he'd been buried here in the ground he'd been trying to save. Detective Webb sat down beside her. "We're going to get justice for him. Pike will answer for this. I promise you that." As the sun sank toward the horizon and the forensics team continued their careful work, Fern stayed where she was. She'd spent 35 years running from this mountain. Now she'd stay as long as it took to bring her brother home. The forensics team worked through the night with portable lights. Fern finally left around midnight when Detective Webb insisted she get some rest. She drove back to the mountain house, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she sat by the fireplace with Owen's journal and reread every entry, looking for details she might have missed. Boone stayed close, his head resting on her knee, offering silent comfort. In the morning, Webb called. "We've completed the preliminary excavation. Dental records from your brother's file confirm the identity. It's Owen." Fern had known, but hearing it officially still hit like a punch to the chest. How did he die? Blunt force trauma to the skull. The medical examiner believes it was a single blow, possibly with a heavy tool or weapon. Quick, but definitely intentional. This was murder, Fern. No question about it. The camera. We're processing it now, trying to see if any film inside survived. It's a long shot after 28 years, but our lab techs are good. If there's anything salvageable, they'll find it. Webb paused. We've also started building the case against Pike. The evidence your brother gathered is holding up. Financial records, witness statements we're tracking down, everything points to a systematic, illegal operation with corruption at multiple levels. When are you going to arrest him? Soon. We want to make sure we have everything lined up first. A case this old, we get one shot at it. We need it to be airtight. Another pause. There's something else. We found something with the remains that I think you should know about. What? A note. Handwritten, protected in a plastic bag in his jacket pocket. It's addressed to you. Fern's throat tightened. What does it say? I'd rather you read it yourself. I'm coming up to the mountain this afternoon to go over some details. I'll bring it with me. After the call ended, Fern stood at the window looking out at the forest. Somewhere out there, her brother had spent his final hours documenting crimes, gathering evidence, trying to do the right thing, and someone had killed him for it. She spent the morning organizing everything she'd found, creating a timeline of events, matching Owen's journal entries with the evidence he'd collected. The picture that emerged was clear. Pike had been running his illegal logging operation since at least the mid-1980s. Owen had discovered it in 1988, tried to report it, and been driven off. When he came back in 1995, he'd been more careful, more methodical, but ultimately, it hadn't been enough. Webb arrived in the early afternoon with 2 other detectives. They spread out their own documentation on the kitchen table, such as it was, since most of the house was empty. Fern had brought in a folding table and chairs from her truck. "We've been digging into Sheriff Culver's background," Webb said, talking to people who worked with him, looking at financial records. "We found some interesting deposits in the years after your brother's disappearance. Regular cash deposits, always under the reporting threshold, but consistent. Someone was paying him." "Pike?" "That's our assumption, but proving it this far out is difficult. Bank records only go back so far, and Culver's widow says she doesn't know anything about extra income." Webb pulled out a folder. "But we did find something else. Remember your brother mentioned a ranger who waved Pike's trucks through? We identified him, a ranger named Thompson, who worked that checkpoint in 1995. He's still alive, retired in Oregon. We contacted him." "And?" "Initially he denied everything. But when we told him we had documentation and photographs, he started to crack. Said he'd been paid to look the other way. Said he didn't know about any murder, just thought it was guys cutting a little extra timber where they shouldn't. He's agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges." One of the other detectives, a younger woman named Santos, spoke up. "Thompson gave us names of others who were involved. There was a whole network. People at the timber broker, a few other rangers, someone at the county planning office who falsified harvest permits. Pike didn't just have Culver protecting him. He had multiple people bought off. And they all just let it happen?" Fern felt anger rising in her chest. "They all knew Owen was killed. Most of them probably didn't know about the murder," Webb said carefully. "They knew about the bribes, the illegal cutting, the cover-up of the operation itself. But Pike and Culver were likely the only ones who knew what happened to your brother." He pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. "This is the note we found with Owen's remains. I've had it analyzed. It's definitely your brother's handwriting. You can read it here or take it somewhere private if you prefer." Fern took the bag with shaking hands. "I'll read it here." She opened the bag carefully and unfolded the note. The paper was water-stained and fragile, but the words were still legible. "Fern, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I left you twice. Sorry I couldn't be the brother you deserved. I need you to know that what I'm doing here matters. This forest, this land, it's more than just trees. It's a legacy. Dad and Grandpa spent their lives protecting places like this, believing that some things are bigger than any one person's profit or convenience. When I was 17, I saw people destroying that legacy, and I tried to stop them. I handled it wrong. I trusted the wrong people. I didn't have proof, just the certainty that what I'd seen was wrong. I'm doing it right this time. I have proof. I have documentation. When this is over, Pike and everyone protecting him will face consequences. But if I'm gone before that happens, I need you to finish this. Take the evidence I've gathered. It's all in the places I've marked on the maps, and give it to someone who'll actually do something. State level, federal if you have to. Don't trust local authorities. Dad made that mistake, trusting Culver. I made it too the first time. You were always braver than you thought you were, Fern. Always stronger. I know you can do this. Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell them I was trying to make them proud. And Fern, live your life. Don't let what happens here define you. Don't carry guilt for things you couldn't have changed. Find happiness. That's what I want for you. Your brother. Owen, December 3rd, 1995. Fern read it twice before she could speak. When she finally looked up, she found all 3 detectives watching her with varying expressions of sympathy. He knew, she said quietly. He knew something might go wrong that night, and he went anyway. Brave, Webb said, and incredibly thorough. Without his documentation, we wouldn't have a case at all. Santos leaned forward. We're ready to arrest Pike. We've got enough evidence to charge him with murder, plus a long list of other charges related to the logging operation and the bribery. We wanted you to know before we move on it. When? Tomorrow morning. We'll coordinate with local law enforcement. Sheriff Martinez is solid, and she wants to be there for the arrest. Pike's not going anywhere tonight, and we want to make sure everything's in place. Can I be there? The question came out before Fern had really thought about it. Webb hesitated. We generally don't. Please. I need to see his face when you arrest him. I need him to know that Owen's evidence is what brought him down. Webb and Santos exchanged a glance. Finally, Webb nodded. You can be there, in an observer capacity only. You stay back. You don't interfere. You don't say anything. Understood? Understood. After the detectives left, Fern walked out onto the porch and looked at the forest stretching away in all directions. This place had taken so much from her family. Her brother, her parents' happiness, 35 years of her own peace of mind. But it had also given something back. It had preserved Owen's evidence, held his story safe until someone came looking. And now, finally, there would be justice. She thought about her father, who'd worked his whole career trying to protect these forests. Had he ever suspected what was really happening? Had he chosen not to see? Or had he truly been blind to the corruption around him? She'd never know. But she could choose to believe that he'd been a good man who'd made a mistake, trusting the wrong person, believing the system worked better than it did. That was human. That was forgivable. Owen had understood that. His letter hadn't blamed their father, had only asked that she tell him he was trying to make them proud. Fern went back inside and pulled out her phone. She had calls to make, arrangements to set up, people to contact. Tomorrow would be a long day, and she wanted to be ready for it. But first, she had one more thing to do. She opened Owen's journal to a blank page near the back and picked up a pen. Dear Owen, I found you. I found everything. And tomorrow, we're going to finish what you started. You were right about me being braver than I thought. It took me 35 years to find that courage, but I found it. I'm not running anymore. Pike will pay for what he did. The forest you died protecting will be preserved. Your evidence, your work, your sacrifice, none of it was in vain. And I promise you, I'm going to live my life. I'm going to find the happiness you wanted for me. I'm going to stop carrying guilt for things I couldn't have changed. But first, I'm going to see justice done. Your sister, Fern, she closed the journal and set it on the mantel beside the family photograph. 4 faces looking back at her, a family that had been whole once, before corruption and violence tore it apart. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of putting the pieces back together. Not the same as they'd been. That was impossible. But something new. something honest, built on truth instead of silence. She looked at Boone, who'd been watching her patiently. "Ready for tomorrow, boy?" His tail wagged slowly. "Ready." Fern sat by the fire and watched the flames until she finally felt tired enough to sleep. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and closure, grief and justice all mixed together. She was ready for it. Vernon Pike lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Colton, the kind of place that spoke of comfortable retirement rather than ill-gotten wealth. Fern arrived at dawn with Detective Webb, parking a block away where they could observe the house without being obvious. "He's got a routine," Webb said quietly. "Gets up around 6, drinks coffee on the back deck, goes for a walk around 7. We'll take him when he comes back from the walk, before he's fully awake and thinking clearly." 2 more unmarked cars were positioned at other points around the block. Sheriff Martinez from Millerton sat in one of them, having insisted on being present for an arrest that would finally answer questions from a case that had haunted her predecessor's tenure. Fern watched the house and tried to imagine what kind of man could kill a teenager for trying to protect a forest. What kind of person could bury a body and then just go on living, year after year, as if nothing had happened? At 6:03, lights came on inside the house. At 6:15, Pike emerged onto the back deck with a mug in his hand. Even from a distance, Fern could see he'd aged. Heavier now, moving more slowly. But the basic shape of him was the same as in Owen's photographs. "That's him," she said, though Webb already knew. They watched him drink his coffee, staring out at his small backyard garden. He looked peaceful, content, like a man with nothing weighing on his conscience. At 7:02, Pike went back inside. 4 minutes later, he emerged from the front door in athletic shoes and a windbreaker, ready for his morning walk. Webb spoke into his radio. "Subject is mobile. All units stand by." Pike walked north, his pace steady, but not fast. He nodded to a neighbor getting her newspaper, lifted a hand in greeting to a man washing his car. Just another retiree in a quiet neighborhood, enjoying his morning routine. Fern watched him disappear around the corner and felt her heartbeat accelerate. This was it. After 28 years, Vernon Pike was finally going to face what he'd done. 20 minutes later, Pike came back into view, approaching his house from the south. He was slightly winded, face flushed from the exercise. He walked up his front path and had his key in the door when Webb gave the signal. "Move in." 4 unmarked cars converged on the house from different directions. Detectives in vests marked police emerged quickly, forming a perimeter. Webb was out of their vehicle and approaching the front door before Pike had even registered what was happening. "Vernon Pike." Webb's voice was calm, professional. "Detective Marcus Webb, State Police. I need you to put your hands where I can see them." Pike froze, key still in the lock, and turned slowly. His face registered confusion, then alarm, then something harder to read. Calculation, maybe? He raised his hands slowly. "What's this about?" "Sir, I need you to step away from the door and keep your hands visible." 2 other detectives moved in, one on each side of Pike. They guided him down the front steps and onto the lawn, away from any potential weapon or escape route. Webb read him his rights in a clear, measured voice. "Vernon Pike, you are under arrest for the murder of Owen Talcott. You have the right to remain silent." "I don't know what you're talking about." Pike's voice was rough, defensive. "I didn't murder anyone." Webb continued reading the Miranda rights without pausing. When he finished, he nodded to Santos, who moved forward with handcuffs. "We have evidence, Mr. Pike. Extensive documentation of an illegal logging operation you ran in the 1990s. Evidence of bribing law enforcement officials and physical evidence connecting you to Owen Talcott's murder on December 3rd, 1995. Pike's face had gone pale, but his eyes darted around. Looking for what? An escape? A witness who might help him? Fern couldn't tell. Santos secured the handcuffs and stepped back. Another detective began walking Pike toward one of the unmarked cars. That's when Pike saw Fern. She was standing beside Webb's vehicle, far enough back to be out of the way, but close enough to see everything clearly. Their eyes met, and something shifted in Pike's expression. Recognition, maybe, though Fern had been just a teenager when he last saw her. "You're the daughter," he said. "The sister." Fern didn't respond, just held his gaze steadily. "It was business," Pike said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Just business. He was going to ruin everything, cost people their livelihoods. It wasn't supposed to." "Keep walking, Mr. Pike," Santos said firmly, guiding him toward the car. But Pike twisted back toward Fern, desperation in his eyes now. "I spent 30 years looking over my shoulder, 30 years knowing it was coming. You think I slept easy? You think I didn't pay for what happened?" "No," Fern said quietly, speaking for the first time. "You didn't pay nearly enough." Webb's hand on her arm was gentle but firm, a reminder not to engage further. She nodded and stepped back. They loaded Pike into the back of the car. Through the window, Fern could see him sitting there, shoulders slumped, hands cuffed behind him. He looked old and tired and nothing like the threat he'd once been. But Owen was still dead. Still buried in that forest hollow. Still gone. Justice, Fern was learning, didn't erase the loss. It just acknowledged it, gave it weight and meaning, made sure the truth wasn't buried along with the body. Webb turned to her. "There's more to do. Interviews, processing, building the formal case. But the hard part's done. We got him." Fern nodded, watching the car pull away with Pike inside. "Thank you. Thank your brother. His evidence made this possible." Webb paused. "What will you do now?" Fern looked east, toward the mountains where her family's land waited, where Owen had fought and died for something he believed in. "I'm going to finish this," she said. "All of it." The news of Pike's arrest spread through Millerton like wildfire. By afternoon, Fern's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, old acquaintances reaching out, lawyers and legal advocates offering support. She turned off the phone and drove back to the mountain. Detective Santos called her 2 days later with an update. "Pike's talking. Not about the murder directly. His lawyer shut that down fast. But he's trying to make deals, which tells us he knows how much evidence we have." "What kind of deals?" "Names. He's offering to give up everyone who was involved in the logging operation in exchange for reduced charges. We're not taking it. We don't need him to give us names. Your brother already did that. But it confirms the scope of what we're dealing with." Santos paused. "There's something else. The lab was able to recover some of the film from the camera we found with your brother's remains. Not all of it, but enough." Fern's grip tightened on the phone. "What did they show?" "Logging trucks at night, clear shots of license plates, Pike directing his crew, and, this is the critical one, a confrontation. The angle suggests the camera was set up on a tripod, hidden in the trees. Your brother wasn't holding it when this happened. What does it show? Pike and another man discovering the camera. Your brother running toward them, probably trying to save the equipment and the film. Pike striking him with what looks like a shovel. It's grainy, it's dark, but it's there. It's evidence of murder, Fern. Clear as we could hope for after 3 decades. Fern closed her eyes. Owen's last moments, captured on film he'd never known survived, fighting to preserve his evidence, even as it cost him his life. "The other man," she said. "Who was he?" "We're working on identification. Pike's claiming he acted alone, that no one else was involved, but the photos contradict that. We'll figure it out." After the call ended, Fern sat on the porch with Boone and watched the sun track across the sky. The forest looked different now. Not threatening, not haunted, just a forest. Trees and earth and the slow patience of nature reclaiming what belonged to it. A week later, Webb drove up to the house. He had news. Pike's lawyer had reached out with a new offer. He wants to plead guilty to manslaughter, claims it was an accident during a confrontation, says he panicked and buried the body, that he's lived with the guilt ever since. That's not what the photos show. No, it's not. We're pushing for murder too. With the photographs and all the other evidence, we have a strong case. But his lawyer is good, and juries can be unpredictable with cases this old. Webb studied her face. "The DA wants to know what you think. What would give you closure? A guaranteed conviction on lesser charges, or taking the risk of a trial for murder charges?" Fern thought about Owen's letter, his belief that the truth mattered more than convenience. "Trial," she said. "Owen deserves the truth, not some negotiated version of it." Webb nodded. "That's what I told them you'd say." 3 months later, Fern sat in a courtroom and listened to prosecutors present Owen's evidence to a jury. They showed the journal entries, the photographs, the financial records. They brought in Thompson, the ranger who'd been paid to look the other way, now testifying to save himself. They showed the photos recovered from the camera, grainy but damning. Pike's lawyer tried to paint Owen as a troubled young man who'd run away once before, who might have been trespassing on private property, who might have provoked the confrontation. But Owen's meticulous documentation spoke for itself. This wasn't a troubled kid. This was a determined investigator, building a case against corruption. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, Pike stood to hear the verdict, with the same slumped shoulders and tired eyes Fern had seen on the day of his arrest. "On the charge of murder in the 2nd degree, how do you find?" "Guilty." The word echoed in the courtroom. Fern felt Beth's hand find hers and squeeze. She squeezed back, unable to speak. "On the charges of bribery, corruption, theft of government property, and conspiracy, how do you find?" "Guilty on all counts." Pike swayed slightly. His lawyer steadied him. The judge set a sentencing date and dismissed the jury. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around, but Webb and Santos cleared a path for Fern. She made a brief statement, thanking the investigators, the prosecutors, the jury. Thanking Owen for his courage. "My brother believed some truths were worth dying for," she said. "Today, the jury agreed that those truths matter. That's all I wanted to say." She drove back to the mountain as the sun set, painting the ridges gold and purple. Boone sat in the passenger seat, calm and content. At the house, she built a fire and opened Owen's journal one more time. The last page now held not just her note to him, but a new entry. "We did it, Owen. Justice served. You can rest now." She closed the journal gently and set it on the mantel beside the family photograph. The hard part was done. Now came the harder part, learning to live with what she'd found and what she'd lost. Pike was sentenced to 25 years. At 74, it was effectively a life sentence. Fern didn't attend the hearing. She'd said everything she needed to say in court. Beth went instead and called her afterward with the details. He apologized, Beth said, for what that's worth. Said he'd been a coward and a fool, that he'd destroyed good people's lives for money. The judge didn't seem impressed. "Neither am I," Fern said. What mattered more was what came after. The investigation, Pike's arrest, had triggered spread wider than anyone anticipated. 2 former rangers were charged with accepting bribes. The timber broker, who'd knowingly purchased stolen wood, faced federal charges. And after a careful review of historical Forestry Service records, investigators identified 3 other illegal cutting sites that Pike's operation had damaged. The state announced that all the affected areas would be designated as protected wilderness, part of a new forest preserve. They were still working on a name for it. Detective Webb called Fern on a cold January morning, 3 months after the trial. "The governor's office wants to name the preserve after your brother, the Fern Talcott Memorial Forest. They'd like you to be there for the dedication ceremony." Fern stood at her kitchen window, her real kitchen, in her house in Millerton, and looked out at her garden, dormant now under frost. Boone dozed by the fireplace. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." The ceremony took place on a bright February day. Officials gave speeches about conservation and courage, about the importance of whistleblowers and the cost of corruption. They unveiled a sign at the trailhead leading into the protected area. Fern Talcott Memorial Forest. Below his name, a quote from his journal. "Some truths are worth dying for. This forest is one of them." Fern spoke briefly, her words simple. "My brother believed in protecting something bigger than himself. He believed the truth mattered, even when telling it was dangerous. I'm grateful that this place, this forest he loved, will carry his name and his legacy forward." After the ceremony, after the officials and reporters had left, Fern hiked into the forest with Boone. She followed familiar trails to the hollow where Owen had been buried, where the forensics team had carefully excavated and then restored the site. A marker had been placed there, not a grave marker, since Owen's remains had been properly buried in the family plot in Millerton. Just a simple stone cairn with a bronze plaque. Here Fern Talcott fought for the truth. His courage protects this forest still. Fern sat on the same fallen log where she'd waited during the excavation and looked around at the ancient trees, the ferns, the quiet beauty of the place. Owen was at peace now, properly mourned and honored. His death had meaning. His work had not been in vain. "You'd be proud of what we did," she said aloud, not caring that she was talking to empty forest. "You'd be happy about the preserve, and you'd probably tell me to stop crying and get on with living my life." Boone pressed against her leg, warm and solid. She'd been thinking about that a lot lately, getting on with living. She was 63 now, retired, healthy, with years still ahead of her. The question was what to do with those years. The mountain house was hers, legally and emotionally. She'd had it inspected, started repairs, begun the slow process of making it livable again. Not as a full-time residence, Millerton was her home, but as a place she could come to when she needed quiet, when she needed to remember. She'd also started writing. Not about Owen's death or the trial, that was for others to document, but about growing up on this mountain, about her father's work with the Forestry Service, about what it meant to love a place and fight to protect it. She wasn't sure it would become anything, but the act of writing felt right, felt like honoring a legacy. Detective Webb had stayed in touch, calling every few weeks to update her on the various legal proceedings stemming from the case. But his most recent call had been different. "There's a group forming," he'd said. "People interested in protecting public lands from illegal exploitation. They want someone to speak about what happened with your brother, to help train others to recognize and report this kind of corruption. Would you be interested?" She'd said she'd think about it. And she had been thinking about it, using what Owen had taught her, what his death had taught her, to help others protect the places they loved. It felt right, purposeful. The sun was dropping toward the western ridge, painting long shadows through the trees. Fern stood and brushed off her jeans. "I'm going to be okay," she told the forest, told Owen's memory. "It took me a long time to get here, but I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to make sure what you did matters. Not just this forest, but other places too. Other people who need to know that standing up for the truth is worth the cost." Boone stood as well, ready to follow wherever she led. They hiked back through the protected forest as dusk gathered. At the trailhead, Fern paused to look back one more time at the sign. Owen Talcott Memorial Forest. Her brother's name, her family's legacy, preserved in wood and stone, and the living trees he'd died to protect. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was honest. It was true, and it meant something. She climbed into her truck with Boone and headed back toward Millerton, toward her life, toward whatever came next. The mountain would be here when she needed it. Owen's memory would be here, honored and safe. And Fern would keep living, not in the shadow of what she'd lost, but in the light of what she'd found. Truth, justice, and the courage to face hard things. Some places hold memories so painful you spend a lifetime running from them. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to turn around and face what you've been running from, you find not just pain, but peace. Not just loss, but legacy. Fern had found both, and she was finally, after 35 years, home.